Okay, good. Okay, thank you, everyone. Sorry about that. Welcome to the Texas Industrial Energy Efficiency Program, the Spring Water Forum, the big picture. My name is Frank Roberto. I'm serving on the Advisory Council, and with others, we assist Alan Rossiter, the TIEEP Executive Director, with organizing these programs. The mission of TIEEP is to provide thought leadership, sharing ideas, technologies, opportunities, and timely information to Texas industries on ever-improving energy intensity, reduced environmental impact, resilience, and enhanced social and economic development. TIEEP's industry focus is the oil refining and chemical sectors, organized by UH Energy at the University of Houston, and funded through a grant from the State Energy Conservation Office, SECO. Today's Water Forum is co-hosted by the South Texas section of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, and will be followed by their monthly dinner meeting. If you'd like to stay for dinner, they are still available at $25 each. The water we use inside our chemical plants and oil refineries is part of a massive system that includes both natural and developed resources. In this year's TIEEP Water Forum, we'll explore the macro water systems in the Houston Gulf Coast area and how this impacts water usage in the process industries. This includes ways to improve the efficiency of water use, issues of equity and sustainability, and a discussion of a strategic approach to industrial water management. Our speakers today are Philip Tosser with Freeze and Nichols, Margaret Cook with Houston Advanced Research Center, and Amanda Tyndall with Veolia Water Technologies and Solutions. Please note that tonight's Water Forum is being recorded. We would like to acknowledge our sponsor as well, the Hunt, Gilliat and Associates, HGA, a multidisciplined project management and engineering services company. Thank you. And PDH certificates will be available at the end. So our first speaker is Philip Tosser, PE Associate, Water Resources Planning, Freeze and Nichols Incorporated. His presentation is Hitting the Trail, the Long Path for Future Water Management. Philip has worked long-range water supply planning and integrated planning in the upper Texas coast and surrounding regions for 17 years. And with his team supporting public entities, state agencies, and industries, including projection of water needs, evaluation of supply strategies, hydrologic analysis around supply modeling, permitting, conservation, and drought planning and supply accounting. He holds a degree in biological and agricultural engineering from Texas A&M, and outside of work, he enjoys farming and hiking with his family. Welcome, Philip.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. And on behalf of the Region H Water Planning Group, thanks for this opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. And, you know, as was mentioned, I, in spite of my tiny little short legs, am rather fond of hiking. I'm not good at it, but I like it. And in some ways, preparing for a hike is a little bit like preparing for water supply. When you get started, you have to check your forecast. You have to make sure that you've got your path mapped out and ready to go. And you need to know who's going along with you for the journey, and you've got to get an early start. But with that, I will leave the cheesy analogies behind, because as it turns out, planning for water supply to meet the Texas miracle is not a walk in the park. It's been quite a challenge. And as you can see from the graph here, since 1980, the population of Texas has doubled. That's a ton of people, a ton of business being generated, and it's already been a challenge to meet the water demands that come with that, and it'll continue to be one in the future. And particularly in the upper Gulf Coast, we've got some considerations here that they don't have everywhere. Now, all of Texas is prone to drought, but down here, when we're not in drought, it feels like we're getting yet another flood. And we've got an extra challenge at the upper Gulf Coast, and that we're also prone to land surface subsidence. So when we're not too little, we still have to be careful pulling our water from. A win situation, planning and for. And to highlight the need for long-range, careful, organized, holistic planning, forward this area, a little diagram summary of how walls evolved. You know, and climate and growth have driven water to temperature center just across the west, around 70 higher off the water. In turn, raise flood risk, that groundwater, which still water reuse to develop. Future for sure. So that's complex enough, but the relationships get even more advanced. You know, it also, at the same time, it's also what's giving us our options for water. The regional districtor that out of all of the attempts to solve those problems. Supplies, and then a lot of the state agencies and state programs are already taking the steps to make sure that we're ready to meet that future and meet those water needs. And so for a lot of my presentation, I'd like to just highlight a few of the major efforts that are going on in this area. And there are a lot of similar efforts across the state to meet needs in those regions as well, but we do have some specific concerns here. One of the major planning efforts that goes on here that doesn't go on other places is carried out by the two subsidence districts, the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District and the to halt subsidence in essentially the greater Houston area, which they've done through a combination of science-driven regulation, but also education and outreach. And through their regulations and their mandated fixing of zones of this area away from groundwater and to alternate sources, really extremely detailed population and water demand projections for this area. And they did some work for the population projections. They did something that hasn't been done in this area before and carry those projections out to the year 2100. And we've never had that before. And these are not, nobody's crystal ball is perfect, but these are certainly not just scratched out guess numbers. A lot of really advanced work went into this. And they worked with two different groups and aligned their processes to do these projections. They worked with the University of Houston, who's got a research group that's developed some amazing employment-based population modeling. And then with an outfit named Zonda, who's very on what's on the ground. If a wooden stake hits the ground, they've got it and they're recording the data. And so those were used to develop projections at a fairly fine scale that were then taken with even more data on where you can't develop, where there's water, where there's floodplain, to develop populations down to the block level, you know, roughly the city block or census block level. And those have already been leveraged by a number of other planning processes in the area. They've also been working to help the long-term planning of this area to update the groundwater models, you know, finer spatial resolution, better definition of the different groundwater layers and the newer science since the last models came out, and enhancing the availability of those models to represent the subsidence impacts of groundwater production. And from that, they're going to be evaluating different scenarios, looking at how do those combinations of supplies, demands, the groundwater impacts could possibly play out to see if they need to adjust their regulations, which drives so much of the infrastructure and supply development in this area. And I promise at some point I'm going to quit hitting that pad and bringing that up. Now, staying on the topic of groundwater for just a moment, in addition to the subsidence districts, this area has a number of groundwater conservation districts that do their individual long-range planning, but they also get together in a state water development board's sponsored process called the groundwater management area process. And so in addition to their own long-term planning, they get together and try to look at from a regional perspective of what are reasonable goals for the future of the aquifers here in terms of things like how much drawdown do we want to allow over the next 50 years, or how much additional subsidence is tolerable over the next 50 years, and look at modeling and see what is a sustainable amount of groundwater production that does not exceed those goals. So that we want to continue using groundwater as a resource where it's appropriate, but we don't want to use it up or sink ourselves into the earth. And so they're doing a lot of work to say, where can we safely go in the future? And both of these processes feed into the state and regional water planning process. And this is a process that came about in roughly 1998, 1999. The first plans came out in 2001 to allow the state water planning process to leverage more of the local knowledge, local expertise. And so the state was divided into 16 regions. Each of those regions develops long-range regional plans that look out 50 years. And those are revisited every 5 years because the state's growing fast and it's a moving target. And fundamentally, this planning process that covers the whole state in these regions is pretty simple. The devil's in the details. I mean, they're 2,400-page reports, but you can summarize the key points in this one little flow chart, and that's that, you're looking at under a repeat of drought or record conditions, a dry year, what would your water demand be? Looking at the populations, the growth in industry in the future, agriculture, power generation. 40, 50 years from now, based on that growth, if we were hit by the repeated drought or record, how much water would we need? And then under similar dry conditions, well, how much would we have and be able to deliver, that day? And combining those two, we're able to identify what are the projected needs and then start looking at strategies and projects that have been recommended by water providers, by industries, by cities, and then look for where there are gaps and analyze those to make recommendations. Now, the planning groups are purely advisory. They don't mandate the construction of anything, but it is really helpful for looking at where everybody's plans are going and where there may be gaps. The region we're in now along the upper Texas Gulf Coast and the greater Houston area is called Region H, which runs all the way down from Brazoria County up to Madison, Leon counties, and covers all or part of about 15 counties. A couple of aquifers, and it covers the Brazos, parts of the Brazos, San Jacinto, and Trinity River Basin. And we're made up of 26 all-volunteer planning group members covering a dozen different interest categories. So it's a very broad perspective. Now, the latest numbers that just came out about a month ago from the process show the latest water demand projections. You can see driven largely by municipal there in blue, and then industrial there in that kind of goldish yellow color. So nothing to sneeze at, 2.5 to about 3 million acre feet. And for those that aren't used to working acre feet, that's 325,851 gallons. It's basically a football field, end zone to end zone, a foot deep. So, and there, I did it again. Now, the good news is we're also blessed with a lot of water supply. We've got a lot of demand, we've got a lot of supply. The green there is the surface water. So we're still, we've moved to a point of being predominantly surface water, but still a lot of groundwater. Now there's a little bit of a caveat on there, and that dash line is how much of that water is actually accessible today. There may be enough in reservoirs in the aquifers, but the amount you can get today is not just limited by how much you can get during a drought or record, but does somebody have a contract to get it from the provider to them? Is there a pipe to get it where it needs to go? Is there a bottleneck in treatment or something else? And so that's a challenge. The other challenge is, even if somebody's got the water, it may not necessarily be where the needs are. And so there may be work in the future to develop new projects, to build new pipelines to get it from who has it to who still needs it. And so it's not just simply adding and subtracting. There's a lot of looking down at the individual entity level. And when we make that comparison, we're looking at nearly 400,000 acre feet of need in 2030. Now that's, and that grows up to nearly 800,000. Now that's not doom and gloom. And there's a reason in regional planning we say need and not shortage, because it's only a shortage if nobody does anything about it, and a lot of entities are already working on this. So a lot of what you see there in 2030, things are already going in the ground, pipes are going in the ground, people are implementing conservation programs to make that a reality. So it's not as scary as it looks, but it is an indicator that we can't just let things run wild. And so once we have these needs, the planning group looks at those plans that are out there, looks at where there are those gaps, and makes those recommendations on potential strategies for the future. And a lot of those are infrastructure, but not all. And one thing that that the Region H Water Planning Group and a number of planning groups recommend is advanced water conservation and loss reduction. So not all the solutions are structural. Now, conservation and loss mitigation are certainly not free, but when you think about the fact that you're saving water, the equivalent of water treated at the tap versus having to build a reservoir, a river intake, and a treatment plant, and a new pipeline, it certainly is a lot cheaper in comparison to developing something from source to somebody's kitchen sink. And one of the areas that there's a lot of potential that sometimes gets forgotten about is in leakage losses. And Texas Water Development Board collects data every year, surveys a ton of systems to try to figure out how much water they're taking in, how much is getting billed, how much is getting lost to meter errors, and how much is just getting wasted into the ground. And just as an example, the little donut on the left-hand side of the slide there is their data from 2022 that they just put out. And the blue there is the part of the intake that's being billed, being actively used, going to beneficial use. Those two little orange colors, that's what's getting wasted into the ground. Nearly over 16% of the intake from the systems they surveyed last year in this region were lost to leakage, line breaks, things like that. It varies from year to year, but I think a lot of people would agree that's an awful lot. The other thing to consider is in this area we've had a lot of growth, so you have a lot of brand new not leaky systems that are kind of masking that and watering it down. There are some that are far worse. And so one of the things the planning group looks at is, what if the folks that did have high loss rates cut that leakage down just a little, just 1% a year, not going from 10% to 9%, but say 10% to 9.9%, just a tiny bit gradually year over year. And it starts out slow, as anything that has to build like that does, but by the end of that, by the time you get to 2070, you'd be saving 60 to 70,000 acre feet a year. That's all of it, just whittling down the loss a little. Now, in addition to the supply plan, something that ties into this a lot, because again, if we don't have enough, we're in a spot of too much, is the state's new state and regional flood planning process. And these are just hot off the presses. The first regional flood plans just got approved and wrapped up. And this is a brand new process. It's very similar in some ways to the state's regional water supply planning process and would model off that, but focused on assessing flood risk and means to mitigate this. And the first cycle that just wrapped up, we're looking at this overall risk, establishing a baseline of what's our risk today and over the next 50 or so years, and what are the known projects that have been identified to deal with that. And then each cycle from here on is designed to evolve and get a little more, a little finer, more detailed. And they're pretty detailed to begin with, so it's a very interesting process, and it would be neat to see it evolve. And it does communicate some back and forth with the supply planning process as well. And just to take since we area crosses 5 or 6 of those regions, let's just look at one real quickly and what it recommended. Here for that's the San Jacinto River basin and a little bit of surrounding coastal basin. Now, to implement everything that the first flood plan for the San Jacinto Basin recommended over the next 50 years is just about $34 billion. And that's a big number. It is over 50 years. But if you look at the cost of not mitigating flood in this area, suddenly that number starts to become a lot reasonable. And if you implement all of those projects based on the analysis, you're suddenly removing the risk from a 1% flood, what used to be called a 100-year flood, from over 100,000 structures, 500,000 people, nearly a couple dozen low water crossings. And so getting to the future is not going to be cheap, but in many cases it's better than the alternative of not planning. Now, one thing that all of the processes that I've been talking about have in common is they're all looking out over long windows, typically 30, 40, 50 years. And the reason for that is simply that to implement these things, you got to get out ahead of them. The solutions to a lot of these problems, some of them can be implemented quickly, some of them take decades. And so that's the reason that all of these processes that communicate with each other, both in this region, in the state, and the other regions around the state, have to take such a long look. And that can be particularly frustrating at times for industry because industry is fairly agile, water supply is not. Most providers just cannot move at the speed of industry. They're not trying to be difficult. I promise they're doing the best they can, but they just do not have that kind of agility. And so it can be quite frustrating at times for industry to try to procure water supply. Industry has some other issues that other segments like municipal don't face. Municipal, when it grows, tends to grow, and even when there's booming growth, nice smooth curves over time. Industry often is unit-based or facility-based. When you have another demand, you're not building a 10th or 100th of the facility each year. You're building a facility. It's there, it's not, and it needs the water. And at the same time, when things get a little tight, it's awful hard when somebody comes to you and says, can you cut your water usage back 3%? No, it can be on or off, and in some cases you can, some cases you can't, but a lot of times things have to be on or off. And so industry faces some extra challenge that some other demand sectors don't in dealing with supply. And when we talk about the lead time here, a good example, and I know we've got some folks in the room that work in the North Texas area and are familiar with this, is the Bodark Lake project, the first major reservoir that's been built in Texas in, I believe, decades. Perhaps the fastest modern reservoir that we've seen. This was fast track. This was everything going perfectly. And so for a major water supply, everything going perfectly, let me put that in context. When this project started, all the young folk were into this hip new thing called MySpace. When the project started delivering water, we were at the point where we were scared the machines might actually be taking over. That's how long it takes to develop a quick project. And so that's a little context on everything going right. And so that's why all these processes look out so long. And one of the advantages that this region has had, in industrial water supply is that probably more so than any other region I've seen, industrial entities here communicate with their providers clearly and try to give them lead time. That's something that's varies by region, but in this area, the relationship between industrial entities and providers is very close relative to some other areas. And that's been a huge benefit for giving those providers the lead time to get that water there when it's needed. So that ongoing communication will be vital, as industry in this area grows, and it's certainly continuing to grow. That'll be vital. As part of that, whenever there are opportunities for expanded lead times, those certainly help the providers, and they understand there, for certain industries, there's issues of proprietary things, but wherever possible, they need as much lead time as they can. Another opportunity that's open out there is a lot of the processes we've talked about today are very open. They're open to they're all public processes. They're all open to stakeholder input from all sectors. And so, in our regional planning group, we have quite a few industrial representatives from different sectors, both on our planning group and in the audience. And that's been super helpful for the region for understanding what the future is for industry. And not just having, folks like me who have a background in ag trying to guess what the next thing in chemicals is going to be. And so that's been remarkably helpful for this region. And we highly encourage everyone that can to get involved with that, give their feedback. There are also opportunities for collaborative approaches. There's certainly some of the state funding programs that are designed for municipal entities or for political subdivisions of the state that may not be directly accessible to industries for funding support. But there are opportunities through partnerships between industry and public entities to help develop those in conjunction. And the agencies, I think, have been fairly supportive of that. And so that's an option out there, is if there's something that you can't necessarily access directly, there are opportunities to work with municipal entities, with water providers on cooperative approaches, and sometimes get better efficiencies for both. And then there are a ton of agency resources out there. In many cases, the agencies are our friend. I know sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but there are a lot of the agencies that really have a lot of data, a lot of support out there for all demand sectors. And so those have been very helpful for all the planning process we've talked about today. And Texas has got, Texas Water Development Board and some of the other agencies have an absolute wealth of data, very accessible, and they're getting more and more dashboards out all the time that make that usable by anybody. And so those have been really helpful. And so those just are some, so that's just a quick recap of what's going on in the area. And again, if there are any questions, be happy to take those.
Question? Hello? Question?
Yes, sir. It can be, and for terms of the leakage losses, typically the losses are much shallower and don't necessarily make it totally to in a meaningful way to supply. It can happen, and groundwater is certainly and particularly in terms of groundwater, it can be a tricky thing. There was a state Supreme Court case about 100 years ago where they just threw up their hands and referred to groundwater as mysterious, occult, and concealed. And that was the official legal judgment. And we've gotten a lot better science since then, but it's a little hard to say on things like that for sure. And I am by no means a groundwater expert.
Hello, my name is Andreas Matsakos. The question I have is about the projections that you're making. We know all that there's high uncertainty on how the weather and the climate in the whole US will change over time, especially for such long projection intervals. How would it display in your projection?
And the projections are intended to be, and that is always, and that's something that the process has evolved to allow a little bit more looking at that over time. Right now, the projections for demand are all based on looking at just a recent dry year rather than a range, just to keep the plan simple. But the plans are, a lot of the plans encourage drought planning as kind of something to keep in your back pocket, drought contingency planning, to give you that buffer for that. And that's something that Water Development Board has been studying is that potential for shifts in climate to change these demands. And that may become a more explicit part of the planning process one day. It's not there yet, but it's something everybody knows it out there. And, I think all of us have a little case of the heebie-jeebies over it because we're planning for a repeat of the drought of record. You could always get one worse, for sure. Yes, sir.
Kirtan Trivedi, in your planning numbers, have you included the impact of renewable energy? So for example, wind and solar, they're going to be producing in excess. And at that time, people may go and say, okay, I'm going to take water and split it into hydrogen and oxygen. And that's going to consume a lot of water to produce a small amount of hydrogen. Is that included in your planning numbers, or how is that going to impact?
Not directly. Texas Water Development Board's methodology for industry is based on kind of a higher level analysis of industrial trends by the region and industrial employment. But that is something that the local planning group has actually set aside some budget for this cycle to look, particularly with the potential emergence of hydrogen, and it could potentially have a big footprint of water. And so while that's not built directly into the projections, the local planning group has set aside some funding to look at how much could that be and what strategies do we need to maybe be considering getting ready for to meet that. And that's something that's cropping up in a number of other regions across the state as well. So it's not directly baked in this cycle, but I think as this process continues on in future cycles, we're going to start seeing more and more of those demands show up in the projections.
Hello. Whatever happened to Coastal Industrial Water Authority? We did it several decades ago. They started switching from groundwater to surface water. Whatever happened on that?
And I'm not sure. Wait, you said Coastal Industrial Water Authority?
Coastal Industrial Water Authority. The term I said, you couldn't take groundwater, make it start
Yeah.
And I'm not sure in that particular case, down here, kind of Galveston County and the southern part of Harris, it's still allowed to have, up to 10% of your demand groundwater, but most of the entities don't. I'm not sure in that particular case if, what the current status is.
I got one question while I'm walking across. So considering how long it takes to develop the surface water, how does that align with the need to get out of groundwater so quickly for subsidence issues?
And that's something that the subsidence district, they started 2010 or so, but that was a process that started quite a long time ago, and the subsidence district tried to give plenty of lead time so that and has phased it in roughly 10-year intervals with the percentage of groundwater ratcheting down each time so that those entities have time to plan. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with the North Harris County or West Harris County regional water authorities, but that's really what triggered them to form was kind of coalitions to get together and do that planning and get out ahead of that. And so it's taking, those entities, even though a lot of the water used to, it's 2 years lead time for each of those little conversion steps to get those pipes made and the treatment ready. What's that? That's becoming more and more of a source in this area. It's still volume-wise not huge yet, but you are seeing more and more people applying for reuse permits, more and more communities building direct reuse for their green spaces in over time. So it's not a huge part of the regional supply, but it is growing.
Okay, last question.
John Larsen, we are seeing all these green projects to make hydrogen and so on from water. It takes a lot of electricity, and I'm involved with some projects. Well, they're being discussed, and it doesn't really apply to Galveston County and this area because we're close to the seawater. So, but if you want to make, say, synthetic methane, you can do that from CO2 and hydrogen. But you end up making like 2 moles of water, methane, right? So this is supposed to be sustainable, which means if you're in West Texas, you're vaporizing 2 moles of water for each mole of methane you're going to make. So in essence, I think that there needs to be something in Texas that says you can't be out in Alpine, Texas and vaporize the groundwater. This is not sustainable. So for here, we can do desalination, seawater, that's fine. Terms like that should be permitted at all unless you start with seawater, salt water.
I think we have one question from online.
Yeah, so this is from John Woods, and he asks, with the building on the Katy Prairie, more water is going to be going into Buffalo Bayou. Is there any way that this water can be captured and used?
And there are, and I can't remember the details, I'm trying to remember the specifics of where there are some existing permits throughout Harris County for reuse of bayou water. There is some potential, some of that may already be permitted, but there's certainly potential for that, and some of that is already going on.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you.
Okay, the next presentation is Margaret Cook, PhD, Deputy Director, Climate Equity and Resilience, Houston Advanced Research Center. Her topic is water sustainability and equity in Texas. In her role, Dr. Cook develops and manages HARC's Climate and Equity Initiative, supports community engagement and community benefits priorities within HARC projects, and her research interests include interconnections between water, energy, and climate science and policy. Prior to working for HARC, Dr. Cook's research included the potential for mitigation of water stress in Texas, as well as improving water recycling in the oil and gas industry to help in reducing total freshwater use in water-scarce West Texas. Dr. Cook earned her doctorate of civil engineering from the University of Texas at Austin Cockrell School of Engineering with a certificate in engineering education in 2018 and dual master's degrees in public affairs and environmental and water resources engineering and a Bachelor of Sciences in civil engineering from UT Austin. Welcome.
A little shorter. All right, thank you for having me here today. Just to give you a little bit of an agenda of what this presentation will cover. A group of researchers with the Texas Water Research Network has come together and developed a paper focusing on water infrastructure issues in Texas, as well as sustainability and equity as focuses within that. So for today's agenda, that'll focus on the major equity and sustainability concerns that we identified in Texas in that paper. Policy, planning, and regulation, which was covered a whole lot in the presentation before, but I'll cover some sustainability and equity issues within that. Challenges and opportunities, and some recommendations. And the other authors who were part of that paper are listed there. There are quite a lot of us. So there might be something where you ask me a question that's actually one of their areas of expertise, and I get to go, I can go find that out for you, but I don't necessarily know it today. So we'll start with water equity issues that are major in Texas. Some of them are major issues that are across the United States, so you might see them in other parts of the country as well. But infrastructure degradation, we talked a lot about water leaks already. That can be caused by corrosion or aging. Over 186 billion gallons of water leaks from Texas municipal water systems have happened, occur in a year, and that's about 51 gallons per water service line, so it is a really large number. And somebody's leak might be somebody else's supply, as was mentioned before, so that can add to surface water or groundwater. But again, as was already mentioned, excuse me, as was already mentioned, it's not going to do it immediately in a way that's measurable or reliable for somebody else to rely on necessarily. There's also sewage overflows that happen from water leaks, and we've had sewage overflows in the Houston area, for example. The leaks do make water more expensive to supply because they're treating that water, or if it's municipal drinking water, they're treating that water and then losing it. That's an asset that they are not getting reimbursed for. If a water system has expensive supplies that they're trying to develop and they're getting more expensive because of those leaks, they also pass that on to the customers, making it more expensive for the customers as well. So that can be an equity issue too. And it can also alter environmental quality, regardless of if it's drinking water quality or wastewater. That's a different water quality than's in the environment, and there could be other things that are in that water, for example, pharmaceuticals or something like that. Next on our list is water access, and we are thinking of water access as water access. It could be plumbing access. It could also just be the water supply access, water supply issues that were mentioned before. So about 44,000 houses in Texas still lack access to plumbing. That's not a big percentage of the state, but that is a significant need for a lot of people. There's also insecure access to drinking water and sometimes wastewater services as well in underserved communities throughout the state. That can be colonias in South Texas or in other parts of the state, unincorporated communities, folks in unsecure housing situations, folks in mobile homes, folks in rural areas. All of those can have a higher likelihood of having insecure access to water. It also happens when there's historic disenfranchisement in the area where folks are less likely to have been, or there's a historic situation where they were not involved in the decision-making for the water system. For example, the lines were drawn to specifically exclude a certain population group or something like that. This is an issue obviously directly because they don't have access to water, but then it can also push those folks to seek unsafe water sources, bottled water, more expensive water sources, things like that. And that is also related to water affordability. With the example I just said, it can push some folks to seek more expensive water sources. It can also, that we think of water affordability in two buckets: household affordability and community unaffordability. Community being what I mentioned earlier, where there's the water system, water is becoming unaffordable for them to provide that water. It might be expensive to keep up with regulations or upgrades. It can lead to higher water bills. It can slow down the process of supplying water. It can affect how industrial users do get their water because there's less water available, or it's more expensive for that system to supply it. On the household side, community unaffordability, as I mentioned before, affects household affordability, and 12% of households in 2017 viewed their water as unaffordable. It puts that household at risk of loss of water service because they can't pay the bills, so they could be at risk of getting the service shut down. During COVID, there were water moratoria that kept folks from losing access to water service, but those moratoria have ended for the most part. Households might also ration their water or seek unsafe sources. Ration meaning they're using less than would be healthy for them to use because they're trying to make sure that they can actually afford their water. And then, of course, seeking unsafe sources would be not drinking the municipal water because they can't afford that. We also have water contamination issues in the state. From the municipal perspective, that might be boil water notices, where there's some contaminant in the water that makes it unsafe for them to supply to the population. And now the system has issued a notice for the residents to boil their water. That would be to get rid of bacteria. There could be sanitary sewer overflows, like I mentioned earlier. There's also lead in drinking water across the state. And in schools in particular. And there was a bill in the last session, I believe, where schools are required to test for that and make sure that they are not exceeding a certain level, and remediate that. Industrial facilities or activities, agricultural runoff or waste from agricultural practices could impact surface or groundwater nearby, and that the water contamination issues are disproportionately more likely to impact underserved communities for similar reasons to what I mentioned before. Frequent water contamination issues erode trust in the system. You have one boil water notice, that's frustrating. You have 10 boil water notices in a year, you stop drinking that water, right? And you're still paying for that service, but so now it's an affordability issue and you don't want to drink that water. There's also issues of smaller water systems actually having the technology to be able to treat the contaminants that are emerging in concern, contaminants of emerging concern. And frequently they don't have that technology, so they're not doing that. And of course, there's flooding. We know that very well in the Houston area. Texas outranks all other states in deaths, injuries, and loss of property due to flood. That's not a list that we want to be winning. And 17% of all flood-related fatalities nationwide are in Texas. Coastal counties like Galveston, Harris County, others in our area up here, all the way on the Gulf, And then counties along the Rio Grande in South Texas rank the highest in the US for flood risk. We can reduce our flood risk with better drainage, some folks were talking about earlier, wetlands, green infrastructure, making choices that help us reduce those impacts. But those infrastructure changes are often less likely to be in underserved areas. You'll see worse drainage, you'll see less green infrastructure, fewer trees, for example. And there's also disparities in who gets access to flood relief funding, which affects, again, those infrastructure choices, but also who gets their homes repaired or things like that. Moving on to policy planning and regulation, they are challenges. There are challenges in the process, and some regulations may be underenforced in certain communities, leaving those communities underprotected. But they are also routes to solutions, and I'll reference some of the things that were mentioned earlier, but try not to be too repetitive. We do have a state and regional water management process that was mentioned earlier. On the surface water side, water rights are allocated generally by prior appropriation. So you have a water right with a certain date. The earlier that date is, the more senior that water right is to somebody else, and they have earlier access to water compared to a junior water right user. And then rule of capture on the groundwater side, which is generally colloquially referred to as the law of the biggest pump. So if whoever, if you have land and you have the surface water rights attached to that land, then the groundwater under that land is yours to use. Both of those can create equity issues with who actually has access to water and can limit water supplies for municipalities, industry users who want to come in and access water, and now there's not enough water available because of who has right to that water. And of course, there are subsidence issues related to groundwater as well. In the Rio Grande, it's a special case where the water rights were adjudicated, basically telling that agricultural users in that area, they didn't have riparian access to that water, so they didn't have a right to it just because they owned the land right there. And municipalities actually had a right to that water, which is a very rare case in our state where municipalities have priority over agricultural users. Generally, agricultural users do have a lot of the senior water rights in our state. We also have rainwater, overland flow, and runoff that are owned by the landowner, and we do allow rainwater harvesting in our state. There's a Coloradan in the room that does not have that privilege, so that's one thing we have over you. Environmental flows are not considered early water planning and have been wrapped in later. So the flows that are needed in a river to just sustain the life that's in that river, mollusks or things like that that live there, not generally considered in early water planning, but are now considered a little bit more, although in some cases there is a right for environmental flows, and there's certain groups that are trying to buy up water rights to be able to allocate them towards environmental flows. We also have drought planning. In the state and regional water plans that were mentioned before, they're obviously highly encouraged to consider droughts in that plan. The fancy graphic that I've got here is from the 2011 drought, and you can really see the intensity that we experienced in the state from that event. That's not our drought of record. It's actually a 1950s drought. So there was a longer, intense drought that we experienced, and that's what's used for water planning now. In our drought planning, we consider drought response, existing water supplies and needs, future water demands, future management strategies and conservation efforts, and financing needs. And that's generally in what was already described. And there is a public input process within those stakeholder groups. They're not prioritizing certain members of the public. It's member of the public generally, which from an equity perspective might privilege those who can be part of the process versus those who are most affected by water issues. There's also local drought planning, drought contingency plans at the local level that do some of this work as well. And then we also have how states respond to drought. Texas Department of Emergency Management doing a lot of the legwork there. And we also have flood planning, which was mentioned earlier as well. We rely on the Federal Emergency Management Agency for flood maps and the National Flood Insurance Program. We rank very highly in our flood risk disclosure. We're one of the top 3 states for that. So another win for Texas. Good job, guys. I assume it was y'all. We also have the Texas Flood Infrastructure Fund, which is a funding source that's attached to the flood planning process that was mentioned earlier. And projects that are part of that planning process could be funded through the Texas Flood Infrastructure Fund. All of that was a response to Harvey legislatively. The Texas legislature put those together after the big event that we experienced in 2017. And on the equity side of things, while we have these success stories in flood planning, more recently in flood disclosure, access to information, access to insurance, and access to mitigation and disaster recovery funds is still highly inequitable in who gets that benefit. On the climate adaptation planning front, we don't have a statewide climate plan. We also effectively don't consider climate in the state water plan process. From the state's perspective, in regional plans, they can consider climate, and quite a lot of them do. Region H does, yes, a little. Region K is, I think, the most likely to do that, and that's the Austin area. And I think San Antonio's area does as well. There's about 5 or 6 of them, I think, that do. We also have multiple local climate plans. In the Houston area, we have the Houston Climate Action Plan, Resilient Houston, and Harris County's Climate Action Plan for Internal Operations, which has a climate equity focus. There's also multiple other cities, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, and El Paso, that have climate plans. All of them consider water within those plans, which is important because of reasons that were mentioned earlier about water stress and the effects of climate change on water supplies, and planning for that and strategies to help us mitigate and adapt to climate change. There are also multiple climate equity advisory committees attached to some of those plans. And another area that we consider in our paper is transboundary waters, the waters, the Rio Grande that separates Texas from Mexico. There's a 1944 water treaty that governs that river, where Mexico must deliver 350,000 acre feet, which, if you remember, is the football field 1 foot deep, on a 5-year water cycle. It used to be that often happened during floods, where they had a lot of water, and then we would get that extra water. We do allow for a water debt during a drought, and Mexico has been unable to fulfill that debt or to reach the supply that they needed to reach with us 3 times since 1992. That treaty was obviously written in 1944, and then, as I mentioned before, we had a water rights adjudication process on that river because it is so stressed. Climate change since then has also made supplies very unreliable. So we do have drought and flood to deal with, and the process does make it relatively unsustainable for agricultural and industrial water practices on that river to be able to predict the supplies that they're going to be able to have to do the processes and practices that they have. There's also limited efforts on adapting and managing water on the river as well. So we consider some challenges and opportunities in sustainability and equity. These are major sustainability efforts that are underway already, and we're evaluating how they incorporate or don't incorporate equity in their water management. So the first is nature-based infrastructure, and this would be practices that conserve or copy how natural processes already do the work of water quality restoration or flood mitigation. So taking that process and copying it, making it for a community. And it can be used for resilience to help communities better bounce back from extreme events. So examples of that would be the green roof at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, but also rain gardens, constructed wetlands, bioswales, beaches and coastal dune restoration, lots of different examples of how that's used in practice. So the great thing about these nature-based solutions is that they can help reduce urban heat, they can help with air quality, they can help with water quality, they can help reduce flooding. There's a lot of co-benefits with these practices. They also tend to be relatively nice looking because they're greenery and it's nice to have that around. However, they're also more commonly applied in more affluent communities. We'll see less of that in underserved areas, which contributes to the things that I've mentioned before, where we have more flooding issues in those areas, poorer drainage, water quality issues, things like that. So that's a challenge to this practice, that we often see it in more affluent areas, an opportunity being all of the co-benefits that it does provide and being able to apply it in more areas of Houston, the Harris County area, Region H, and Texas broadly. We also look at One Water, which is a philosophy that all water has value, and we can think of it all together. It's not drinking water and wastewater and surface water and groundwater, it's one water. Stormwater, seawater, any of those things. It also accounts for water quantity and quality together. It's a unified planning process, ideally for long-term resilience, because you are thinking of all of those things together. There are communities that are already considering this, for example, Austin or New Braunfels. And there is an emphasis on engaging a wide variety of stakeholders in that process, including people from underserved communities. That is an opportunity for this. A challenge being, it's still a challenge to make sure that they are included, that they are engaged, and they are prioritized in water planning processes, especially when they're impacted by decisions. So our recommendations from this process are that there should be equity in spending government funds at the local, regional, state, and federal level. For example, in the federal process, there's currently a Justice 40 mandate, for example, for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And Justice 40, just for reference, is a requirement that 40% of the benefits of that government spending flow to disadvantaged communities. The definition of what counts as a benefit is still up in the air, but it's at least a movement towards trying to make sure that the folks who have been historically left out of planning processes, infrastructure investment, or the benefits from new projects, for example, hydrogen that's been mentioned a few times, those folks are actually receiving a benefit from those activities. We also recommend incorporating more community voice in planning and co-designing solutions. That can include the statewide planning process that I mentioned, it can be at the local level, it can be within One Water, I mentioned before. There are a variety of ways to increase community voice in planning. At the industrial level, we see community advisory boards and using them to help with decisions on benefits or risk management. Increasing public engagement with earlier involvement in the planning process is important. Making sure that they have, that you're setting expectations for how that planning is going to go, because quite often community, what we consider engagement, is sort of a checkbox that like, hey, we have this plan, look at it. What's your, this is the engagement. And so the change would be actually involving them in planning earlier in the process, making it accessible, making sure that folks know how they can participate, that there are methods to incorporate them, people who wouldn't normally have access to meetings. For example, the most popular or the most common person would be somebody who is middle class and has the ability to adjust their schedule and the time to attend a meeting. So if there's ways to make that meeting more accessible, that have childcare, transportation, food, something like that, that's a recommendation. And then in planning, incorporating lived and practitioner experience, both of those things. Our third recommendation is identifying and dealing causes legacy solution to which are close that evaluating and finding when there are drainage disparities, doing research with community where we can incorporate their lived experience and their practitioner experience of the previous recommendation, and doing that research together. We also talk about barriers to improve technology, policy, and remediation. And that is my presentation. So if there are any questions, I'm going to get my water.
Thank you, Margaret. Any questions?
Hello, my name is Andreas Matsakos. I have a question that's probably related to the whole thing, not necessarily to the subject, but it's about the certification of Texas. The certification, of course, is the disturbance of the ecosystem. Is there not enough water, the vegetation dies, the weather changes, and essentially the agriculture even may collapse. And I'm not saying that out of science fiction. I was in California. Mono Lake is disappearing, and the state of California is struggling. Lake Mead, of course, in the last 3 or 4 years has been going down upstream of the Hoover Dam. And the AlChE, I looked it up again, the AlChE in Kazakhstan has dried up. It was a big lake. So is Texas at that risk? And certainly that would have justice and equity, because probably those locations would not be uninhabitable. The people who live there will have to move out.
So I don't have a good grip on if we are at long-term risk of those things. In 2011, folks did run out of water in their communities and did have to truck in bottled water. I think in Wichita Falls, for example, that's an extreme case of that happening. So we are at risk of water supply issues related to what you're talking about. As far as long-term lakes drying up, I think the water planning process, their goal is that does not happen. I would say that. Do you have any further comment?
When the state's permitting those water supplies, they are trying to do analysis to not permit more than would be reliable. Again, that is based on the historical drought. So when they're granting permits, they're trying to make sure to not grant more than would be would be reliable so that you don't end up in that situation. But again, the worst drought we've seen, in the last 100 years. So, there's always risk, and there's certainly a need for conservatism beyond that.
Yeah, my question is somewhat different. Excellent presentation, a lot of information, a lot of detail. My question is regarding the water quality. Are they still only checking E. coli and few other bacteria and viruses, or they have expanded the testing on the water? Because every so often you say the water is contaminated. And I just want to know if the state or the city has changed the new method, like the pharmaceutical companies are using it. They have no contamination. So I'm saying is that need to be somehow to be addressed to the state or the city or whoever. And there's another thing is, which I'm very concerned about it, is the Legionnaire disease is produced by the water. Are they looking into Legionnaire disease because there's no cure for it?
So on your first question, we do test water, and getting water to an extremely clean water level is very expensive, and so that's why pharmaceutical companies can't afford that. That superconductor companies get their water very, very pristine. That we wouldn't drink that water because it's too clean for us. But the cities that can get their water very, very clean, they're doing it because they can afford to do that. So that's one of the points that I was making earlier, that smaller water systems where they have a lower budget are going to have a very hard time dealing with certain contaminants. And you do see some water systems have boil water notices or other issues with their water more often than others because they have affordability issues. So that is a concern, and it is a reality. If we wanted to get our water to a hyper clean quality, we would need to fund our water systems a lot more. And as far as Legionnaire's disease, I don't know anything about that in particular.
50% of the diseases are waterborne in the United States. It's costing $1 billion a day.
Did you want to add anything to that?
I just wanted to throw in a slightly different question. You mentioned Justice 40, which obviously impacts federal funding and how that is used, and the necessity to work towards equity. In industrial projects, so obviously most of our audience here is related to industry in this area, do you see within companies attempts being made to build equity into their planning for water and in general community engagement?
So because of the requirements of Justice 40, and in particular, for example, the Department of Energy and their requirements for a community benefits plan with all of their funding, we do see that wrapped up into federal applications for funding. That's just, it's a requirement, it's part of that process. It's going to need to be incorporated. As far as what companies are doing, they may or may not be influenced by that process, but over the last handful of years, many companies have moved more towards thinking about environmental justice, even outside of what the federal funding priorities are. I think a lot of what during COVID influenced that. We see companies with a DEI focus, we see companies with environmental justice focus, maybe an environmental justice aspect of their company, and considering, many companies have been thinking about social benefits and risk management already because that's just part of the social license to operate. And so marrying those things into what they consider environmental justice, something of that sort, we see that as well.
Okay, last question.
Very nice talk. So something on the other end of the spectrum, flooding. There's a lot of buildings in floodplains, and there is insurance that covers most of those. and many people rebuild after a flood. At one end of the spectrum, you have people who can't afford to go anywhere else, so that they're forced to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, and it costs a lot of money. The other end of the spectrum, you have people who take advantage of it, and they rebuild their luxury home in a floodplain because they like the view. Do you see a path to social justice there, a way of getting equity and not having to rebuild all the time?
There is an effort to buy out properties that are frequently flooded, the repetitive flood properties like that, so that people don't live in those areas that are frequently flooded, because it is a burden on the insurance system. We also, on the two sides of the spectrum, you do have people who continuously rebuild, but there are also people that just can't participate in the insurance system at all, and then they don't have the funding to rebuild, and there are still people with tarps on their homes from Harvey, which was a long time ago for somebody to still have a tarp on their home. So as far as a path to social justice, I would go back to the recommendations we had where there's more equity in how funding is distributed. I don't think that we have that in our current flood insurance process. But the effort towards buying out those properties that have been frequently flooded is an effort towards that. There is an equity issue even in that, because the market value of that home is going to be pretty low if they're frequently flooded. But the value of it to that person is, I mean, there's a familial value to it, but also just in the brick and mortar of the home, you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. If they're going to try to get a 3-bedroom, 2-bath in any other area of the Houston area that's not flood prone, it's going to be much more expensive than the one that is. Do you give them that value, or do you give them the market value of the home when you buy them out? That's a concern too.
Thank you, Margaret. Okay, next up is Amanda Tyndall, Vertical Market Manager, Industrial and Environmental for Veolia Water Technologies and Solutions Analytical Instruments. Her topic is Industrial Water Management Strategies for Compliance, Sustainability, and Cost Efficiency. With 10 years of experience in the water industry, Amanda and her team partner with industries and municipalities to solve water quality challenges from ultra-pure water to wastewater. She has previously worked as a senior product manager and application specialist with Analytical Instruments and a product developer with Crocs Footwear. Her background is in chemical engineering with a bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt University and a master's from the University of Cambridge. Amanda lives in Boulder, Colorado with her husband and 2 dogs and is an avid runner. Welcome, Amanda.
Great, thank you so much for having me today. This has been 2 fantastic presentations so far, so I'm really excited to follow up on that. And my goal today is to share some research, share some trends, thinking about how water management, water reuse, and then control of that with monitoring could enable some opportunities. So we'll go through an overview of a big picture. Where are some places that water is used? How might we reuse that in different places? What some of our concerns are with regards to regulatory compliance, sustainability goals, how we're going to manage both of those together, and then the idea of how enabling more water reuse in the industrial space can improve our efficiency and often reduce our costs, and how we can best manage the water for what that reuse purpose is. Then we'll tie in at the end of how monitoring can help control and save those costs along the way. So to begin with, this is just some of the areas, when we think of water and how it's used. We like to think of it as like a river-to-river approach. A plant is a box. We bring in water from some water source. We use that in multiple places, often or always in steam, in cooling, within the process or within the product itself, and then eventually that water goes back out. That's the same water that is then sourced into our drinking water plants. That's the same water that goes out through distribution. So that concept of one water, it really is all that same H2O molecule, and we're just using it in different purposes. So the main thing that I'm thinking about here is, okay, well, how can we find out what that purpose is, what that quality requirement is, and then how do we make it fit for that purpose? We don't have to make ultra clean, ultra pure water for every application. That might be overkill, and that might be a waste of cost and resources. So the two big things I want to take away, if you stop listening now, is, all right, that water must be fit for purpose. What is that purpose, and how do we understand what the quality goals are and how we can get to that? Because the technologies are available to do that treatment, the technologies are available to do that measurement, but we need to have that target available so we know what we're working towards. And then that other thing is, okay, we have those tools so that now we can set those targets. We can set our KPIs for efficiency, for compliance, for quality, and by having that data, we can then use that to drive our decisions. So we say all of that with things changing, and we have various challenges. We've got a slew of climate challenges. We've talked a lot about those, from flooding to drought. We might have good quality. So then what do we do with things like new regulations, contaminants? Just because we can measure it, do we know that effect on human health and the environment? How do we quantify that? How do we enable things like reclaim and reuse and recycling of that? How do we have better desal opportunities? It's there, it's available, but it hasn't really taken off yet because of the costs. And then how do we make sure that our wastewater discharge is of the quality that it should be to not affect the environment, and then the next person that's taking that water out from later down in the river? We have all of that with a shift in market. We have shifting workforce. I think we've said in both the presentations, COVID's affected a lot. We have different generations coming in that have different expectations, even of what work means to them. All the while, we're still managing supply chain constraints and starting to steady out a little bit there, but in our business that some people have gone out of business, or some markets are just higher than they were before, some parts are available to access. We've got infrastructure and we've got assets to protect. Some of those are older, but water quality affects the condition of those assets. And then we're looking at how do we secure data, but then also how do we use data to our benefit with AI and with machine learning. How's that really going to affect us? I don't think we really know yet. So combine those two challenges with corporate sustainability, and the one thing being, how do we use this data and how do we use water management better to avoid risks and protect what we have, but then also build in proactive measurements, build in that safety to brand reputation, that control, and overall trying to reduce these uses so that we can improve the cost scenario. So I've got a couple examples now from what a refinery water balance might look like, what a chemical water balance might look like, and then we'll get into how we affect regulations and sustainability. But here's just a couple ways. Okay, there are all these different water uses at a plant. There are all these different water discharges, and these are all of different qualities. Well, if we have certain treatment and the location is right, maybe we can repurpose this discharge to actually use for one of the water reuses, or use one of our purposes used. And we say that because we look at these numbers at the bottom. And some of this research I mentioned is from Bluefield Research, so that's a really good source for what's happening in different water markets. But we use a significant amount of water, we discharge a significant amount of water. I'm not going to get too deep into the numbers here, but we use more water than we make of product, and that's pretty consistent across industries. We also have water that we take in as our initial makeup water, and the majority, at least of our refineries here, are using surface water. Well, that surface water quality can be variable. Some cases we might be taking water in from a river that is worse quality than we are required to put back out into that river. That's an uneven situation for a plant to have. So if that plant could then, instead of discharging that water of a better degree than they got it, maybe they could reuse that for purpose inside the plant, and then maybe they could reduce the intake water that they're required to take previously. And then this opens up the idea of how could we reuse that? Well, some places are obviously through a steam system, different ways of reusing whatever that wastewater is, stormwater, rainwater here, correct, in Colorado, but how can we take those and then repurpose them? Looking at it slightly differently, but from like a chemical plant side, we might have some of the different wastewater discharges. We also might have some different water uses. There might be more in the product itself, perhaps, or within production processes. And overall, if we look at the chemical industry, we know that organic chemicals, making those are the most water intensive, ag chemicals are typically the least, and in between, you use different sets of water. But that water spend, not only is that the intake, but it's also the research, it's acquiring that, where we're getting it, and then how much it costs us to even discharge that water back. So right now we're in a scenario where water use, water management isn't a top priority. Even when we think about improvements, chemical plants are often more concerned about energy discharge, air emissions, and even plastics. So right now we're at an opportunity where we can start to think about planning and improving for the future and having water be a part of that. Because it's not only from a brand reputation, but it's cost savings and process improvements that we could gain from that. So looking onto the regulatory side, a lot of this is around discharge compliance. And so just doing a quick Google search found very easily several headlines that pop up. So this isn't only an effect on, possible degradation of the environment, it's degradation to the brand, it's additional costs, it's fines. And so the thought behind this is if we are able to improve our discharge compliance, but then also get it to a point where we can now, instead of discharging that, use that. Now we know the quality is good, and we can avoid this kind of publicity and press, and we can make sure that whatever we do discharge is going to improve the environment for the next person that's going to pull out of it. When we think about the discharge, we've got a series of parameters that we've got to hit according to whatever NPS DES permit we're looking at. Number one is probably looking at those toxic pollutants. So how is that going to affect the environment? How could that affect human health? And then looking at, nutrients, so your carbon, your nitrogen, your phosphorates that can then degrade that environment itself. But then also think about that water source. Eventually, that water molecule is going to become an intake to a drinking water source. So it's all tied together. And the more that we can improve that, the better we can not only comply with those limits, but we can improve the performance as well. But then we think about, okay, well, that could be expensive to improve that treatment. It's often considered a cost center, whereas we can easily get funding for production process improvements, things within the plant, because that's usually what produces profit at the plant. But one way to think about this and flip it is not only do we have wastewater and we've got to deal with it, but if we can minimize that waste in the first place by using our water smarter or possibly discharging it to another place where that quality is fine for that purpose, minimizing that waste is the easiest way, and that lowers the treatment requirement. It lowers the load to that wastewater. We also know that intake of water can start to be expensive, especially if the municipality is discharging, back, and that water gets nicer, or maybe we're in an area where there's a drought, the water intake is going to get more expensive to an industry. So thinking now about, okay, how can we use reuse? We can possibly generate new ways of sourcing that throughout the facility and start to look at it from, okay, reducing our regulatory compliance issues, but maybe improving, brand, improving that competitive advantage. If we're not one of these names, then that improves the business overall. So then transitioning that into, okay, now we've got a lot of facilities looking at making and publishing their own sustainability goals. And through some research, it tends to be that more B2C customers or companies publish more of their water use and their water management plans than B2B. So we see a lot in like food and beverage, pharmaceutical, they publish a whole list of what they're doing from a sustainability standpoint. A little bit less on like power, mining, and some chemicals if they're going to another business. But being Veolia and coming from a French company, I recently saw this corporate sustainability reporting directive. And so this is going to affect not only facilities and companies within France, but over 50,000 companies, even those outside of the EU. And all they're looking for right now is to report social and environmental risks. So every company is going to start to being required to do this. And well, this type of thing might not come to Texas, it might not come to US, at least companies that are multinational companies might have to start to record a lot of this information. So what can we do about that, or what are we starting to see? Well, these are a few companies that are starting to list out how they're going to think about water management. And the trend you'll see here is, number one, we need to look at plants that are within high water stress areas. So where they don't have access to that intake water, or that water is being used for other important needs like drinking water, maybe they need to address that first and start to figure out how they can reuse the site, reduce their water intake, or improve their discharge. Only a few of these here actually look at, all sites and how they can build in better water management plans. So I think this is going to start to change, maybe not in the next year, 2, 3, but maybe in the next 5 years or so, we'll start to see this list grow and be more inclusive of all sites. We've looked at kind of how we can maybe think about the regulatory side, we've looked at the sustainability side, but really it comes down to how can we start to use this to reduce our costs and to drive up efficiency. Well, I'll give a few examples here, and the first one being just returning condensate. Okay, that can minimize our wastewater, and it can also decrease our freshwater intake. Great, those are two very clear reduction in costs. Reusing that wastewater, and you'll see this one didn't quite finish here, but depending on what that wastewater contamination loading is, and that's where it's good to identify, okay, what's coming to our wastewater plant, then you can identify if it's a low period, maybe you have an opportunity to even repurpose that for washing or hosing down equipment. It all depends on what that quality need is for that repurpose. So boiler feed water, we need really good quality water. Cooling water, rinsing water, not as good. So then we can adjust the treatment and the cost of that to be fit for that purpose. And then if we don't have a use for it on site, at least we could try to improve that discharge quality and start to avoid costs maybe associated with regulatory fines, environmental degradation, or even those kind of hidden costs about avoiding corporate sustainability and that brand reputation. So one thing that I want to note at the bottom here is there are some guidelines on how we can better use our water, but also then how do we improve the efficiency of that water use. And that's driven by even some of these regulations. So last bit on efficiency and opportunities from wastewater before we move on to how process monitoring can help is that I was at an event recently, and it was in Colorado, and it was an innovative water technology seminar, but most of the people there were talking about recovery of wastewater and what we could do with that. So some of the ideas that I noted down here, this is about either capturing our phosphorus from our wastewater, using the CO2 from, say, some anaerobic processes to use that for making different kinds of cement, different kinds of fuel, use that as some kind of input, using that on-site heat maybe for biogas, or even making biopolymers from some of that wastewater that we've got. So there's a recovery of products market from wastewater that we could gain. And then we have to think to some of the questions after the first talk, how are these energy sources going to shift in terms of our water use? So I thought those were really great questions. We know that hydrogen, at least right now, the technologies require very ultra pure water. Well, how much energy, how much water go into making that versus what are we going to get in return? I think those are all really good questions. But in general, the best way to mitigate our waste and our wastewater is make less waste and then prepare for how we can reuse it. Think about how we could recycle it or recover it in other ways, with disposal being the least optimal case. But how do we really use this? Well, process monitoring comes into play when we want to ask these kinds of questions. Okay, let's say we want to treat this water to some use. Well, how do we know if it's good enough for that use? How do we know if the treatment's working? How do we know if the wastewater system is overloaded? How do we know if we're discharging into compliance? All these things are great questions that can be answered through better monitoring. In the past, it's been very standard to just monitor at the point of exit and say, am I in compliance or am I not? And maybe those were done with a grab sample and they were sent off and we didn't really know for a couple of weeks. But now it tends to be shifting towards where it's better to know what is coming to the wastewater at the beginning, because that's going to shift a lot, especially in industry. And using continuous monitoring or getting, know what your major contaminant's going to be, looking at that before it even goes to treatment. And then afterwards, we'll give you an idea of how well that treatment is working and if you're moving as much as you should be based on the treatment that's there. So there's opportunity to use this water quality data and this process monitor that hit those desired purposes. And the way I like to think about that is, okay, start from a map and identify where those tough areas of contamination might be or where there's areas where you could start to optimize. I mean, in general, when we think about process monitoring, it's three main steps. You know, we're not talking lab tests and very high analytical and looking at perfect accuracy. We're looking to really understand a trend. But first, to understand a trend, we need to know what the baseline is. So what does good mean? And good can be different based on a plant. Even within the same company, you could have different locations that have different quality baseline of that water. So first, it's good to know, like, all right, if everything's running smooth, what do we want to be at? Then from there, how do we detect a change from that? Because that's what could alert us if we can't use it for one of these other purposes. And then when we have that, then we have to be able to use that data to take action. We don't just want all the water quality data forever to have data that's not useful. We want the data that's going to help us make those decisions and then be confident in those decisions. So some examples of when we don't understand our water quality or we have poor water quality is you could have premature replacement of equipment. You could have poor heat transfer, so then you're not as efficient. You could have effects like scaling or microbial growth or corrosion, and all that leads to higher operating costs from degraded water quality. You could even have an issue where equipment completely fails. And we also need to take into account where that's in. That could change over time, or we could be downstream of somebody else that discharged something out of compliance and we didn't know, and now that affects everything inside the plant. But when thinking about how to apply process monitoring, the point I just made about we don't just want data for data's sake, it's got to make sense. So the way I try to think about going about it is first, map out a facility, identify who's the biggest water hog, where do we have the biggest water quality issues, and then identify what's that contaminant or few contaminants of concern that can really give you insight into how it's performing. Is it something like metals? Is it something like organics? Is it microbial? Is it nutrients? Is it an emerging contaminant that really needs to be measured? And identify what those key ones are, and then look at the location of where it makes sense to monitor for that. And it might not be right at the point that you want to, because maybe the water that it needs to get to is over here. So you got to think about what makes the most sense, and then identify what's the right type of tool. If the water doesn't change that often, maybe a lab, taking it to an analytical lab is fine. Maybe if it changes a lot, you'd want something more continuous. But things to think about when adding monitoring are things like speed, safety. Obviously, you don't want to be carrying in hazardous reagents for an analytical tool into a plant. That doesn't work out well. What range is important, how high are your contaminants going, or how low are your contaminants going. Identifying what those key points are then help you identify what the right tool is. And it's not just the tool itself, it's then how does the tool perform over time. So hopefully you have this tool for 10, 15 years, and you don't want to have it fail after 1 year. You don't want to have to do a lot of maintenance on it. It should be useful. That's the goal of this. It shouldn't be another pain point. So to kind of summarize, and I guess I ran through that quickly, but we want to think about water management, how we could reuse, and then how monitoring can help with that. So we've talked about how better water management can help us improve discharge compliance. It can help us achieve our sustainability goals or make those sustainability goals, enable reuse, ideally minimize the waste, and lessen our freshwater intake that we're having. But in addition to that, if we're at a plant and we're making lots of different products, or we have multiple batches, by monitoring those rinse down cycles or monitoring the product itself, we can try to prevent contamination. We can try to prevent having to throw away whole batches because something gets contaminated. And ideally, if we're looking at cleaning out equipment, maybe we can reduce cleaning cycles or reduce chemical use. We have this treatment equipment and we want to be able to protect that and use it to its fullest, but if we are sending bad water that's going to foul membranes per se, then we're not using those membranes as effectively as we should. So there's other opportunities that can be gained from this kind of water management and understanding that water quality and how it can be reused. So to kind of summarize it up, and I guess we'll leave some extra time here, but we're facing challenges. We're facing challenges with regulations, with climate, with sustainability pushes, all the while trying to manage costs and maintain competitive and profitable. We've got opportunities to improve efficiency and save costs through better water management, and the only way that I can really see to using that water for different purposes is knowing what water quality target you have to hit. And the only way to do that is through process monitoring to understand what that quality is, give you that better control, and then give you the confidence that you know you're in compliance. So it brings about that awareness so you're making the data-driven decisions. So with that, open to any questions.
Thank you, Amanda.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks. It was a great presentation. You know, you talked about monitoring and control, and a lot of the concepts were kind of inside the fence line. What do you do if you have bad water quality, or how do you keep bad water quality from getting outside the fence? And then you talked about matching water quality, right? Like, you don't need more, or somebody might take your bad water and really use it. Is there an agency or an initiative or anything kind of on a macro scale where people kind of do like matchmaking and say, you know, you've got here that's 10 miles away from an industrial facility, and you could link them up if you knew it, but who's trying to put the two things together to make it the most efficient? Is there anything going on like that, or?
That's a really good question. There might be, I don't know if I'm too aware of any. What I have heard though is, I was reading something yesterday about the food and beverage industry starting to think about reuse. They don't have standards, they don't know what critical control points they need. So there's a group of people from the water industry, from the reuse regulatory standpoint, from food and beverage companies, and even people, you know, higher level within government that are trying to get together and see if they can put some of these guidelines together. Because that fit is so important, or else you're wasting time, you're wasting money, you're wasting energy. When I went to this seminar that I mentioned, the people from the wastewater industry were more talking about, well, we can make this product and then the market will come. And I'm like, I don't think it really works exactly that way, but I didn't, you know, question them. So I think it's gonna be a little bit of both. They've gotta have somebody to help them, like, understand what the need is from the market. And if we can identify what that need is, then we can create those partnerships. I know there are a lot of industries, for example, you know, breweries and some food and beverage facilities that will take their and their mash and send it off to a field or ag, or they'll even have like a nearby farm come pick it up. So those types of things are happening on the local level. In order to be more efficient about it, we need it to happen more on the macro level. And we need, maybe it's consultants who can find that identifier that can make them together. There probably is. It's probably some 3-letter, you know, acronym.
Thank you.
Sorry. This question might not be directed directly at you, but in unincorporated Harris County, land developers or somebody that's interested in using their property and build on it are now required to have retention ponds. That also includes commercial and residential. That retention pond, in my mind, costs. Yes, it's good if there's flooding and you collect all this rainwater. Those ponds are actually isolated from groundwater. Is that true in the city of Houston? And therefore, what are we doing with that water that's lost, not reused?
That's a good question. Do either of you have thoughts?
Nice try.
I mean, maybe, I mean, the ideal, I'm not a retention pond expert, but I guess my just 2 cents might be, you know, you could think of it as lost, or you could think of it as that retention pond is now not flooding somebody's home, or that retention pond is now not, you know, affecting something else that could have been in that spot. If it's an area that's already low-lying where water is going to collect, it's more like an opportunity cost versus it being completely lost.
Sorry, the other part of that puzzle is you get enough rainwater and such, and the pond overflows and you need flooded out then.
Yeah.
That development.
Yeah, I think about that often when I see developments, these big ponds. I'm like, well, okay, that's getting close to the top.
One question I have is about foreseeing the future. whether the Texas industry will be under strain to minimize their water use. Something we have seen in other geographic locations. I think Canada was restricting, for instance, the shale oil industry from withdrawing water from the rivers. California, of course, is rationing the water to the farmers and the municipal. So are we at the risk of getting there? And as a corollary, maybe as a question, if there is time, are there any economic incentives to prevent us from getting there?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have a magic ball to see the solution in the future, but it has to make sense. And this could get to probably some good discussions on should the government incentivize that, should they not, should it be more market driven? But if the water's there and it's plentiful and it's not needed for other uses, then sure, let industry have as much as they need. But if the water's not there, there's obviously the need to reduce that. So that's where you need to put pressure on it. But as these companies that have locations in multiple spots, and they're doing this at one location, they find maybe a benefit from it, then maybe they do want to do it at another location because it saves costs. That's where I think I can see it happening.
It's kind of along those same lines, and thinking back to one of the slides that Philip showed where water reuse was just a small sliver of the water availability. How do you really try to make that bigger so that it becomes appreciable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, talking to Philip about that point earlier, he made the comment, it's small, but it's still a lot of water. And if we look a couple years ago, that little piece was probably a lot smaller. So if we look at just that, we'd think, wow, maybe we're doing a really good job. How do we grow that, though? I think it's other factors. I think it's if we can find ways within a facility to save costs by reusing, great, that makes sense, let's do that. I know in Colorado, we've got some draft DPR regulations, we've got our IPR regulations out there, so direct potable reuse and indirect potable reuse. That point on the municipal level, we really need time to get those regulations, get the communities used to it. But I think on the industrial level, where if we know, the fit for purpose that we can get there, it makes sense from an economic standpoint.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, thank you to all three speakers. I think it was really well the way they all kind of integrated with each other, so thank you. Sadly, this brings us to the end of the forum, but we do have some closing announcements, some QR codes for those who are looking for PDH certificates and the like. So the first is that the next Energy Forum will be May 1st, 4 to 6 p.m., and the venue will be the University of Houston, so maybe a little easier to get to for some who are on the north side of town. The theme will be energy and decarbonization, the big picture, so following along the same lines as tonight's water. There's a link in the QR code there. In addition, Jim Risco will be presenting a 2-day refinery and chemical plant steam system workshop, April 30th and May 1st. And that will also be at the U of H campus. And it's from 8:20 to 3:30 each day. And if you think back to the previous slide, the second day of Jim's workshop is the same day as the Energy Forum. So you can get a chance to spend 2 days at the U of H and get a workshop in, as well as getting the TIEEP Energy Forum in. There's no cost to attend, although you are responsible for parking and meals and such. As a part of just trying to keep the program relevant, there's a survey, so please take a look at this. This will be available. I guess, Ellen, do these slides become available online? Yeah. Yes is the answer. Just repeat. Okay, so for people in the room, these are available. The presentation will be available online as well too, to fill out the survey. And finally, PDH certificates are available here. So thank you very much. The AICHE meeting starts at 6:30. In the room, Zoom meeting starts at 7 o'clock. I think between 6:30 and 7 people in the room will be eating. So thank you everyone for attending and hope to see you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone. We're going to be shutting down the Zoom now, so have a great day.